For a long time, the way you lead feels settled. The business runs, your people respond, your decisions land, and results repeat. And from inside that experience, it's easy to believe a few things at once. That what's moving is because of you. That the way you're leading can grow and be sustained. And that the value you bring is clearly yours. But what feels stable isn't always what lasts, especially when it's never been tested. I was a top-performing wealth advisor, leader, and executive in the wealth management industry for 23 consecutive years, building and running multi-billion-dollar businesses. So what are you going to learn today? 1, where enforced alignment can quietly be mistaken for real leadership influence. 2, where your leadership success isn't actually sustainable. 3, how to tell if the value being experienced is truly yours or just inherited. And 4, what has to be built for your leadership levels to hold. What determines whether your leadership actually holds comes down to 3 things most leaders never separate. First, whether people move because of your influence or because alignment is already doing the work for you. Second, whether your leadership can sustain growth or whether everything still depends on how much you personally carry. And third, whether anything about your leadership is truly yours or whether what's working is something you've learned to operate aside. So let's start with influence, because alignment is the easiest thing to mistake for your success as a leader. At certain levels, your results stop feeling fragile. The business runs, your people respond, and things move without any resistance. And from your seat, it's natural to assume this is your influence, because movement happens when you're involved. And to you, nothing feels forced. Nothing feels borrowed. It just works. And that's easily how this gets misread by you. Some of that moving right now isn't responding to you. It's responding to alignment that's being enforced way above you. And as long as that pressure exists, momentum will feel effortless to you. But over time, you stop seeing the enforcement and start feeling the outcome. And without realizing it, that alignment begins to feel like your influence. Because inside that environment, your results don't feel conditional, they feel earned. But the risk isn't alignment. The risk is losing sight of how much of it is doing the work for you. Because alignment doesn't announce itself when it's fading. It just quietly loosens. And when that happens, you don't notice it at first, but your team does. They're the ones who feel requests slow down. They're the ones who sense hesitation when there used to be momentum. And they're the ones who hear not right now instead of course. But they don't question your leadership. They assume you got it covered. And by the time it reaches you, what used to move easily can now require much more of your effort. And you see it where follow-ups multiply. You push for movement that once happened on its own. And that's when the exposure shows up. Not in activity, but in your influence. Because when results hold for a while, it's easy to mistake alignment for something you built. Work advances because it fits someone else's priority, because it aligns with a scorecard that had nothing to do with you, and because enforcement makes follow-through easier than resistance. And while that holds, your results look like they're yours. But when it shifts, the lease will expire. And this is the question that leaders at your level eventually have to answer. If your alignment changed tomorrow, would your results still hold because of you, or would that moment expose how much you depended on that alignment instead of your own leadership? Because when alignment shifts, what gets revealed isn't process. It's whether your leadership was actually carrying the outcome or whether it was being carried for you. Because results that rely on enforcement alignment can look strong for a season, but the results that are embedded into how your business actually runs are what will hold year after year. And if you haven't separated this yet, everything can feel solid right up until the day it isn't. And once influence starts to separate, the next thing that shows up quickly is your sustainability. And this isn't failure. It's whether the business can sustain weight without pulling everything back to you. And you see it, the business is still running, but more decisions find their way back to you. More situations pause until you weigh in. And at first, this feels like leadership to you. You're close to the work, you're protecting quality, you're making sure decisions don't drift. But underneath that, something else is happening. Your ownership isn't extending, it's stalling. And people technically have authority under you, but they don't fully own the outcomes. They bring decisions to you not because they can't decide, but because they don't know how you would. Your judgment is still the operating system for everyone. And as long as it stays there, your ownership never fully leaves you. And even your reasoning, it stays close. Your standards stay assumed instead of explicit. And the decision logic, it stays in conversation, not embedded in the business. And here's how that shows up at work. Your team gets on calls with you for help. You jump in, you help solve issues. You stay involved while things get fixed. And every one of the calls sees you as helping, which feels right to you. But the people that are actually on the call with you there to resolve the issue are thinking something else. They're saying, why is this leader on this call at all? And at the same time, the advisors who need time with you for growth and strategy are waiting. And when they ask you for time, the answer is always the same. I'm tied up dealing with a lot of issues right now. And from their perspective, your role is supposed to be focused on the few areas only you can influence. So they start wondering, quietly, why so much of the time you spend on work that doesn't add incremental value beyond you. And they don't see this as misalignment with you. They will see it as a missed expectation. And they still believe they're helping you, escalating issues, protecting outcomes, bringing everything to you. But that belief creates the opposite result. Your time gets pulled into work others should already own. And the work only your role can do keeps getting crowded out. And at the same time, your team will never learn how to carry judgment forward. They don't learn how to decide the way you do. They just learn how to wait for you. And this is the sustainability test most leaders never separate cleanly. Because the question for you is, who can actually run parts of the business without you? Where does your responsibility stop short because dependence still feels like value to you? And where is your time being pulled into decisions that prevent you from influencing the areas only your role can influence? Because when ownership doesn't extend and judgment doesn't transfer, your sustainability quietly turns into constraint. Not because the business can't grow, but because too much of it is still living in you. Now let's look at inheritance. This is the point most leaders don't expect. The business works, your results are consistent, your momentum continues to hold. And from your seat again, it feels obvious that what's happening is yours. You're in it every day. You're making decisions. You know how things run. And because it keeps working, that familiarity turns into certainty. Because to you, if it's working, it must be yours. But the problem is that certainty rarely gets tested. Not because anything breaks, but because nothing forces you to separate what works because of you from what works without ever being traced back to you. And that's the difference between running a business well and being able to explain clearly and specifically why it works. Not in the language of culture, not in alignment, and not in how things are done here, but in terms of deliberate ownership you actually caused. And this is where inherited success quietly shows itself. You've learned how to operate what was already in place. You became fluent inside it. And because it produced results, you never had to define it. So when you explain why things work, your explanation sounds familiar. Not because it's wrong, but because it's not distinct. You describe process, you describe structure, you describe behavior. And then you're put in moments where explanation matters. You're asked to speak to a team that doesn't report to you, an offsite, a conference, a room without your context. You explain to everyone what drives your results, what you focus on, how you lead. And afterwards, the reaction is simple from everyone. This isn't any different from what we hear already from our leader. And that's when the gaps start to show up. Because you struggle to point out what you deliberately put in place that changed how the business actually runs. Because people will follow you, but they're responding as much to the role you occupy as to anything you actually created. And as long as results hold, that distinction stays hidden. You can run a business extremely well without ever making it. But when conditions change, when what was once carrying outcomes no longer does, the lack of your distinction shows up fast. Not as failure, but as sameness. Your leadership sounds like leadership everywhere else. And this is the final test that inheritance creates. When you describe why your leadership works, what part of that explanation clearly traces back to your own decisions and design? What do you point to that didn't exist before you shaped it? What can only be explained through your judgment, not fluency inside what you inherited? Because knowing how to run something is not the same as knowing what you are actually responsible for building. And if you can't separate what came from you from what you learned to sustain, your leadership may produce results, but it will never feel distinct. And that difference determines whether success for you is transferable. Because you are the only one who has the ability to design your own leadership path. You decide whether people move because of your leadership or because alignment is already doing the work for you. You decide whether your impact can grow or whether everything still depends on how much you personally carry. And you decide whether what people experience as your leadership comes from what you've put in place or from conditions someone else could step into and reproduce. Because if you don't separate them deliberately, they blur. And over time, your leadership can keep on producing results without ever becoming portable or distinctly yours. It's whether you're willing to take responsibility for building what has to exist outside of you if you want to reach the level you're aiming for, now that you can see it clearly. Every week I break down the real strategy behind top performance for wealth advisors and leaders ready to operate at the level they're built for. This is EliteVate. We cut through the fluff, no hype, no theory, just strategy, psychology, and execution. If this hits home, subscribe. You're not just watching and learning, you will become the model others follow.